My name's Dylan J. I have a company in Australia and UK. We do a lot of government stuff. I've been involved in Plone from 2003, maybe? Yeah. And so several years before that. I was leading the UX team for a while. I'm still quite involved in that. And I also want to apologize in advance. This talk is not as polished as it could be. I have this affliction that every time I come to a conference, something technical goes wrong that requires my help. And this one was no exception. So, okay, I'll start. First off, I want to say that Plone 5 is awesome. It's a huge amount of effort that's gone into it. It's staggering particularly certain individuals who have put so much effort in, and the efforts that's gone in. It's the biggest thing about it, I think, is that it's slick and modern, and this really came home to me. I did a Plone 5 presentation at PyCon Malaysia recently, and you really can see. I mean, we as developers are more subjective, and perception matters more than we think. We think we're logical people, but when someone sees something modern and slick, they get the impression that it's something that is up to date and ready to use. And Plone 5, this is the biggest thing about Plone 5, I think, is that it gives people the impression that it's something that is going to work for them because it's modern and slick and up to date. But it works pretty much the same as it's always worked. I think the real exception here is the folded contents, things like bulk editing and stuff like that. That is a genuine improvement in functionality. Otherwise, the way the editing experience works functionally is pretty much the same. It looks nicer. There's small UX tweaks and stuff. So really, what I want to talk about today are the bigger, harder problems. And the problem with these harder problems is is that we're all really used to it. We're all people, pretty much. Has anyone been in Plone? Is like an end user here, someone who's not a developer or is just using Plone for a small amount of time? Pretty much everyone here is very, very familiar with Plone, and the problem is that if you're creating something which is usable by someone who's coming in completely fresh, it's hard to have the same eyes as those people. It's a really difficult problem. And all the things that I might suggest changing here, someone else will have another opinion about and say, no, it works for me. Why would I bother changing it? And that's part of what makes it hard. So a couple of years ago, I started an effort as part of the UX team to try and catalog lots and lots of these harder problems that were particularly that I would see in training, in running support business. We run a support business for Plone, so you see the same things happen. Like I just clicked on a button and suddenly my landing page has disappeared. What the hell happened? Support issues like that, and you see patterns coming through. So I put a Trello system up. Anyone could submit to it. So not all of the contributions were mine. There are other ones, and then it had the voting, and then it got reordered based on that. One of the interesting things about it is that not much is actually being ticked off, and that's what this talk is about. So what I've tried to do in this talk is I've tried to group some of them and present some of them, and then there's probably some others that weren't included in that original list. I'm also in the process of moving over a lot of those issues into GitHub. And really interesting thing, someone was just asking me what the talk was about just before, and I was saying it was about usability issues, and he listed a couple of usability issues. And I'm like, we'll put them as bugs on GitHub. And he's like, no, they're not bugs, it's usability issues. And I'm like, are you insane? Like, we should be treating usability issues, even if you don't have a solution, you should put it as, this is too confusing, this is hard to do, I don't understand how to do that. We should be approaching this the same way as we approach technical bugs. And we should be putting them in there. And a while back I added these tags. So you have one for UX for integrators and themes. There's 3 of them. It's roughly the same idea as this, is that you'd have 3 columns. So you're dividing up who the users are, who it's affecting. So you've got editors, you've got themers and integrators, and you've got site admins. Site admins are the ones doing things like setting up workflow policies or adding users and things like that. So 3 different sets of users, and we almost have 3 different complete interfaces within the Plone UI for these different kinds of users. So if you search on there, then if you look under, say, enhancement plus UX integrators and themers, you'll get a list of things that people think should be fixed. Maybe there's some better tags we can use, I don't know. Yeah, so these are hard problems. So we have the will in the community. I think it's no question that people think these are important. But I think there's a whole bunch of things that mean that we don't get to these problems as quickly as we should. Often there's no obvious correct solution. That kind of is a big stopper. It's like if you've got a technical bug and it's like, here's the way to solve it, you know, getting developers behind it to fix it is a lot easier. There's often conflicting opinions, like I was talking about before. It's when you have people who have very different use cases and they're very wedded to what's currently there or their own other solution, it's a problem. Yep, there are often strong opinions too. And it's often very subjective because we're talking about user problems. So the people who should have the voice are the users, and the people who are discussing it are developers. So who actually has the better, who is better in touch with the end users of those 2 people? Hard to tell. And this is what I think is also a problem, is that you know, developers don't have user problems, and because we're doing open source, you know, developers are good at scratching their own itch. That's what open source is all about. Sorry, when you're doing a volunteer, you scratch your own itch. So, and developers are motivated to scratch their own itch a lot more than some other user. Unless they're getting paid to do it. So there's a mismatch of motivations. And the UX team is there, but the UX team is very difficult because in a traditional organization, what you'd have is you'd have UX people, you'd have some boss at the top saying, you UX people, you tell what the developers what to do, and the developers are paid to listen. So even though they might not understand it and say, you know, technically this makes more sense, and the UX person says, no, this is more usable, the UX person may win out. Here, UX, you can't tell volunteers what to do. It's a very tricky thing to do in a open source community, and I think that you know, Plone does all right at it, but I hope we can work out ways to make it better. And I think one thing that really set Plone out at the beginning was that we had a person with authority that people would listen to, who really took usability to mind. And that was Limmy, and that really helped shape Plone. And I think, you know, having a benevolent dictator who people respect and whose opinion can be the final decider is very helpful. And there's Limmy right now, very happy that he doesn't have to tell people what to do anymore and have it not always listened to. So I think, in summary, I think that you know, these are hard problems, but I think it's really important for us to try and tackle these problems. And this is what a friend of mine said once, which is something that I keep on coming back to. It's very, very true. If we can solve some of these usability problems, then we have a chance of having a USB, like a unique selling proposition for Plone, is that we can say, you know, like, we are easy at the moment, but we could be the easiest CMS to use. We could be the easiest CMS to theme. I honestly believe these things. Like, we are close, and if we really concentrate on them, I think we can say those with confidence. So a little bit, what I want to say is that one thing I see is that I gave a talk last year all about sort of usability things, and I talked about the SOAPy process. This is something we do. What we do now in our internal processes, we always put the problems first. And I noticed that a lot of times the way people think about bugs and features and plips in Plone is they put the solution first. They come up with this idea, and then they try and justify it in terms of the problems it solves. And I am finding again and again and again, if you put the problem first and then you put all the options down into one bug ticket, for example, and you say, here's the user problem we're facing, I have a favorite solution, but here are all the other possible ways to do it. It really structures the argument around which one solves the problem the best. It's about compromise as opposed to people taking sides and going plus and minus, you know. And I think if we can start using a process like this, it can help the debate. Okay, so now I've got the top 5. So folders are basically broken, I think. I'm being a little bit extreme there, but the folder metaphor is okay. Like it is reasonably easy to understand, but it breaks down in lots and lots of different ways when in practice. And I think so. For example, you know, so you've added a page and you want to add a subpage. That's a classic one, right? So then suddenly you've got to go, oh well, my page now, my menu item, which was my folder now. You know, my page now has to become a folder, and then I've got to move this page as a default page, and then I've got to put the sub-page that I was going to put underneath that page back into that folder and, you know, shuffle it around. It's not the most complicated thing to understand, but it's still really not how a lot of other CMSs work, and I think it's holding us back. So here's one I talked about before. That's another default page kind of bug where the display menu is something that doesn't explain itself particularly well, and suddenly you don't expect it to actually change something so much. It's not even a post request. Like anything that changes data should be a post request. The display menu is not a post request, which is a bugbear of mine. And we had a really interesting situation once actually where we had an automated health check go in, and we created this sort of pre-caching thing that would go in and not just do a health check, but it would actually try and load all the links off the page. And because of a misconfiguration, it actually was running as an editor or an admin user. So we had our health check actually turn off the whole landing page, and it could have done worse. Like I don't think it can do deletion, but it can do things like changing state as well, you know, by not having post requests. So how do I edit a menu name? A lot of CMSs really work in terms of having menus as a structure, having content, and then you map the two together. You know, so you create the content first, then you think about how to structure it. Plone forces you to think about structure before content, which is not so nice. Like it changes your workflow. It means a lot of you've got to think a bit more about what you're doing. And the consequence is that if you don't quite understand folders and stuff, and it's like, well, folders become the menu, folders, the information architecture is the folder structure. I have to, particularly if you've got a default page, then you have to understand that going and clicking contents and then editing the title of the folder is what you have to do to change the menu name instead of just go edit the menu. How do I publish a folder? Again, it's sort of default pages are kind of making that confusing. Yeah, this is about publishing and sort of the way the security model works, that you know, folders versus default pages. I've published my default page, but I haven't published my folder, and then suddenly people can't see it. So yeah, changing content types is also a thing that is potentially an issue. And also this idea that, you know, because of this sort of folder structure where we expect everyone to move around the site to place things, all that movement has to happen. You've got to go and like navigate to here, navigate to here, navigate to here. One of the reasons people say WordPress is simple is because you go to the control panel and you click add blog, and then it puts it in the right place and adds it to the menu structure. We are forcing users to do extra things when you have a site that is quite constrained, like that doesn't have the flexibility. You don't always have a site structure that lets you create everything everywhere. It's actually kind of unusual. You normally have a news folder with that's the only place you really want news to go, and we should be making it easier. Yep, same sort of thing. So I displayed a whole bunch of user problems, and now I don't have all the answers, but and I'm gonna display a whole bunch of random ideas, some of which may work, some of which don't work, some of which are not mine, but there's lots of possibilities. So, for example, one thing we could do is we could we can take the display menu and we can put it part of the edit interface, so that it's much more a sort of a heavy thing, and it gives the ability to preview and gives you the ability to have more descriptions and so on about what it is it actually does. Folderish content, that's another potential way of solving that. You've heard a lot about Mosaic, and Mosaic's not the only way of solving this, but the idea that, for instance, so one way of solving it, I think Rob from 4 Digits came up with this 2 years ago, was that, well, we can put the display menu as part of the edit thing, and we can have one content type that is both folder and page and has a display menu in it. So you either switch between the display menu concept, where it's showing the list of the contents, or you edit edit the main body and show that, and you don't have two things. But yeah, then you've still got the problem of how do you make landing pages with other kinds of things like collective cover or something like that, or collections and so on. Oh, I think his one had collections built in as well. That's right. So it was three content types in one. So then there's the kind of idea that, well, so if you have only a pages, and the pages are folderish, and then you can have tiles, and then what you do is collections become a particular tile type. So if you want just a listing view and nothing else, then you've got one tile that you place in there, and that's your listing view, essentially. So you get rid of display views, you replace them with tiles. Then what you do is you have how you solve the problem of having default views that are other kinds of content types. Is you have, I don't want to go over it too much, because you can, if you didn't see the Mosaic presentation, you can do embedding and stuff. You can basically use an alias, what used to be called an alias tile, and you can bring in another content type which exists somewhere else, and then have it displayed as a small part of your page or as the whole page. So it's up to you. So remove the displays views, remove default views. There are other ways of doing it. I was working on a thing called TinyMC tiles, I think, kind of like, but it doesn't have to be Mosaic. So placeless content is another idea, which is that we try and have the ability for you to create the content first and think about where it goes second. You can have an add new button that basically works from anywhere in the site. If you've only got one place that news goes, then you click add new news any place in the site, and it will default to, let me just, yeah. So, what we could do, for instance, is that when you add new, you can have the location there and the short name. So if it's a news item and there's only one place on the site you actually allow news items, so the site administrator has locked it down, then you can't change this. It just will jump there, and you never need to worry about where you create a news item anymore. If you haven't thought about where it wants to go, then you can perhaps have a sort of a temp location that most things go, and then you can go and edit it again and change the location. You don't have to have the separation between editing and moving. It's all part of one thing. So really what you're doing here is setting the URL as part of the editing process. Or we could do, maybe there's the idea of actually sort of changing the way we do menus. This is probably a bit more radical, where we actually do it like other CMSs do and say a menu is something that you edit and assign things to. Possibly you have menus not 100% linked to the site structure. It's something we could explore. So content types are broken. And this is sort of like, well, what we have is we've kind of constrained the way in which we can deal with content, because a content type is normally built to only handle one kind of thing. And when you've got a page and you want multiple things on the page, suddenly you want videos on the page. We've got hacks around that using like styles and so on like that, which will replace a URL. But what happens if you want something more complicated? What happens if you want a listing or a map in the middle of your content? Why do you have to have, the Plone way of doing it is to have a map content type, and to have, maybe you'd have a map content type with a rich body at the top and a rich body at the bottom, and the map has to be in the middle. That's one way of solving it, and it's too inflexible. Same idea. So I'm not going to go over it. I think Mosaic is a good solution to this. And if you didn't see the talk before about Mosaic, then go back and watch it. It's an old idea. I guess the real trick about Mosaic is that I think theming is incredibly important. I don't think many people actually install Plone sites and leave them with the default theme. I think that's unrealistic. And theming is often the process of deciding how much control the users get, what they can and can't do. And Mosaic is definitely kind of on the side of it's trying to be editor friendly. And we need to ensure that the themers still have the ability to not give that to them. It shouldn't be the case of if we go all in with Mosaic and we've got no way to lock it down, then I think it's not going to work. But I think the people working on Mosaic are kind of aware of these issues, which is good. And I think there's ideas like protected tiles, and I think they're definitely thinking about these issues. But this is a really hard thing to solve, and it's only going to be solved, I think, exactly how Philip Bayer said, that it's going to be used as a plugin for various different use cases, and we're going to try and iron it out, I think. So it's the same stuff. Oh yeah, and the other thing is it's very much grid. It pretty much requires grids. What if you don't want to have a theme with grids? What if you're re-importing a theme that doesn't have grids in it? What do you do then? Sharing is confusing. I don't know how many people think sharing is confusing. I think, yeah. Possibly a lot of people, I think this is an example where we're all really on board with the model, we understand how it works, but it's not as intuitive as we think it is. So here's one that we came across. The word roles is really confusing. So people have this idea of organization roles. You're coming from an organization with lots and lots of different job roles and stuff. So they look at the UI and they see a whole list of like, oh, there's roles here. I need to add my roles, right? So the right way of doing this is to add groups and use groups as roles, right? But it's not really obvious in Plone that that's how you do it. That what we're talking about in Plone with roles is Plone roles, is your role within the Plone universe, right? Not what you might think as a role. This is a stupid bug that annoys me, the fact that you have in the sharing tab one definition for what an editor is, and I think it's even called permissions or something, or it's not called the word used roles. They are the same thing, but they're called two different things in two parts of the UI. And it's been there for a long time like that. So we don't have any way to describe what happens with a workflow. There's not a lot of description, so you have to know what's going to happen, like who gets access to what at which particular point. Like, if you do for submit for publication, it changes the permission so that the reviewers can see it, but then the editor can't edit it anymore. You have to know it. It's not written down anywhere. There's no way to discover it. Yeah, how do I know I've been given the editor? You've got this amazing ability to sort of delegate permissions. We've got no way to let people know that they've been delegated to. Again, it's just a silly oversight that's easy to fix. Yeah, it's like the permissions model is a little bit unintuitive in that you still have to publish everything individually, and it's possible to sort of make things visible within a folder, and then depending on the theme, it'll sometimes work and sometimes not. I think the whole concept that you keep the thing private and then share it with certain people is not intuitive. I think Google Doc style, you hit share and you can make it publicly visible, you can make it visible to certain people, etc. I think we can improve that. This idea of saying it's private, and then not only is not intuitive, but once it's actually done and you're looking at it, right? It says private. It says it in big red writing. This thing's private, but it's not. You've shared it with a bunch of people. You don't know. There's no way to know unless you go and have a look at it. How do I share it with outside users? I think we've been using the token role product. Sorry, I've forgotten who did it, but it's something that should be built in. I think sharing stuff without outside people who aren't members is a good idea. Google does it basically helps Google Docs work really well. We can do it pretty easily. It should be built in. So ideas about fixing sharing. So I talked a bit about this. We should change the word roles. Get rid of the word roles. There's a bit of debate as to what's the best name. Permissions is probably good. Developers don't like that because Zope has a particular definition of what a permission is, and it's not roles. So that could be confusing, I guess. So then we have to come up with something else like capabilities or role sets or, permission sets or something like that. But we shouldn't use the word roles. And personally, I think that we should get rid of the concept of going into the site setup and actually setting global roles. We can just have a link there that directs you to the local roles, the sharing tab of the root folder. And that would help introduce the idea of sharing, because a lot of people just ignore the whole sharing thing. They don't really see it unless it's explained to them. And we basically are encouraging them, add a user. As soon as you add a user, you have the ability to give them roles. That's what we're saying. We're saying this is the default way you should do it. And it creates all sorts of problems later on to do with if you want to then delegate it, then suddenly some users have this global permission everywhere, and the ones that you set up, specifically in groups or using local roles or stuff, suddenly they can do more than what you thought they could. I think that this idea of combining workflow and sharing, the two things go hand in hand. They are part of the same concept. So the idea that you will share something by making it private and then sharing it is not obvious. The fact that you would do submit for publication, which goes to reviewers, and then you set the reviewer role, right? You're going to assign a bunch of people as reviewers, and they're the ones that get access to it. We need to somehow bring those two concepts closer together. Putting them on one page could work. And somehow, I don't know how we do this. I think we need to sort of make the idea of groups more obvious. The fact that groups can represent roles, because you can have groups within groups. You can create a whole hierarchy of roles within an organization. It's a good way of modeling things. And we kind of hide that. Groups are sort of on a second tab. It's sort of hidden away. Maybe we can make groups as the major part of the UI. You start with the groups listed, and then you add users into those groups instead of starting with the users, right? And maybe you can classify. We can have classifications of groups. Maybe you can have different. So one set of groups are organization roles. Another set of groups are capabilities, and then you can somehow separate them in the UI. Yeah, content rules for sharing changes would be a good idea, so that you can get notifications when you suddenly have extra rights. So here's one kind of idea about combining sharing with workflows. So instead of having a drop-down box, I know people like the fact that you can just really quickly do it, but let's say we get rid of the drop-down box for publication and we combine it with sharing, and we have one tab called maybe sharing, maybe something else. Again, not everyone agrees on that. But the idea is that we're trying to sort of marry these things up so that you can see who is actually got that role in that particular context if you switch to that. Sorry, it's the other way around. This is the workflow, and this is the role. So you can see that the can view is active in whatever current published state. So then you can see who has the can view if you move it into that state. That's kind of the idea. And we put it all on one page. It's an extra click, but I think something like this, where we're really sort of showing users exactly what's going to happen when they publish, when they do the workflow, could really help marry those two concepts together. So getting started is hard. How am I doing for time? When does this finish? 10 minutes? Okay, so Buildout is broken. So this really came home to me. I sat in on the training to do with theming, and we spent they did about 10 minutes saying, here's how you can edit the theme through the web, and they spent the next day dealing with Buildout issues and all sorts of, compiling and all this kind of stuff when you did it through the file system. I'm being a little bit glib, but it's Buildout is a big problem. And getting started, I think the fact that we basically start with an empty site, we have a news folder, but we've got nothing else. We really don't show the capabilities of Plone. We show very small bits of capabilities of Plone when you create a brand new site. So this idea that I've created a site and what I want is a blog, how do I do that? We don't tell you how to do it. There's some ways to do that, maybe not in core Plone, maybe it's part of distributions or something else, but hosting is another issue. So it's still sort of the case that, I think this is getting easier. I don't think this is too bad, because I think that more and more you've got Amazon solutions, you've got BitNanny, is it BitNanny or whatever it is, where basically, you can hit that and suddenly get a running Plone thing. We have that Heroku button and stuff. But it's still an issue, and it's not an easy one to solve. So you want to install a plugin. Suddenly you've got an empty Plone site, and you're going like, but there's this excellent plugin that will do blogging for me, and what do I do next? Oh crap, that installation was easy, but now I have to learn Buildout, and now it's breaking, and now I'm just going to use WordPress. So you might install the things, and then suddenly a little bit later, we were talking about this the other day, that with Plone 5 you've got lots of different upgrades, and then suddenly you use a plugin, and suddenly that requires all these extra bits, and suddenly then a whole bunch of Plone packages get upgraded that aren't compatible with your version of Plone, and it's all broken. Buildout doesn't really tell you why. It's a bit ugly. So distributions. I think just the idea of knowing good sets of plugins. We have this idea of Paragon. It hasn't quite happened, but it will happen, I believe. It's going to happen, right? Paragon? Yeah? Okay. But what if Paragon was available as a versions file on the collective, where you basically, which was version per version of Plone. So you could get the Plone 5 version of Paragon that had all the known latest versions of every single plugin, or at least the best ones, and then you can just include that, and then you don't have to deal with this idea of someone's upgraded a plugin that relies now is, like, basically what you have to do, right? Every time you install a plugin is you have to go back and look through the changelog, and hopefully someone's written, I've now dropped compatibility for Plone 4.1. Because as soon as you do that and you don't see that, then suddenly it upgrades everything, because it's now relying on Plone 5 or something like that. So we could help solve this. We should not be all individually going out there and working out which plugin is compatible with which Plone. Installers with plugins included. The idea of distributions. The idea that there are certain kinds of sites or certain kinds of plugins that most people use. Plone Form Gen. How many people use Plone Form Gen on their sites? So why can't you download an installer that includes Plone Form Gen? Why do you have to? Why would you have to use Buildout to install it? So distribution should be a first-class citizen on the Plone site itself. You should be able to create your own distribution maybe and upload it as if it was a plugin, and then have all the installers created for it. That's not that easy to do, but installers should have default site content. I think one thing that happens in the WordPress community, which is interesting, is that WordPress themes come with content quite often. It's not always the right way to do it, but it also really helps people get started for common kinds of sites. I think it's not a bad idea, and we should support it in our themes. I think we should do more cloud-first stuff on Plone. I think we have installers, we have Windows installers, etc. But it's not the way a lot of people just want a site quickly. We should be helping them do that. WordPress has WordPress.com. We don't necessarily have to have Plone.com, but we should be giving as much precedence to a button that goes and installs it on AWS or any other way that you can instantly get a site in the cloud. So Yeah, I think that it's possible with distributions. If you have distributions, you could create a theme that says, this works with the education distribution, or this works with, you know, Plone Blue, which includes a whole bunch of common plugins. So then you can build better themes, right? Because the theme can expect certain things to be there. And because the theme is installing also default content, then you can do more complicated things in your theme that set up certain things that would be difficult otherwise. You'd have to give a long set of instructions, put this here, then you know, publish this, and then you put the style in, et cetera, et cetera. We should have it's crazy that we have Planet Plone, and Planet Plone runs mostly non-Plone sites, or at least maybe 50-50. We should be supplying a blogging platform for Plone people that uses Plone. The main reason people don't use Plone is because then they'll have to install it and maintain it. But so I don't want to go over hackability too much because I think there's another talk on it. But yeah, I generally have said this many times. I think most of the tutorials encourage a way of development which says that you use JBot, you override templates, you create custom content types to create apps. I think Plone is a CMS and apps are apps. They're two separate things. Apps, you start with a blank application and you build it up from there. We shouldn't be encouraging people to create apps using Plone. It's the wrong tool. We need a way to install plugins through the web. They don't have to be all plugins, but they should be. You should be able to have integration code that that you can install with a theme that does a whole bunch of interesting things to you, and that come with the theme. Yeah, because Buildout. We use a lot of Plomino now. When we want to build an app, we want to do something kind of complicated with regards to integration, we pretty much always do Plomino. Like, if we want to do a user management system, you know, where you've got a whole bunch of users and stuff like that, we don't use Membrane, we don't do using content types. It always stuffs up. It always gets complicated. It always kind of, you end up trying to override something that Plone is trying to do, and you want to do this. It's a bad idea. Something like Plomino actually starts with a blank slate and lets you do whatever you want. I said that already. Running out of time, I know. So theming customization. I kind of talked about that. Yeah, rules are really good. Diazo is awesome. Diazo is such a good tool because it lets you have almost no limitations about changing Plone into something that you actually want. But it is still kind of complicated. And people do like the fact that you can have an HTML file and just hack it and get what you want. Having theme galleries and stuff, like having the ability to basically install different themes easily. Theming the back end. As in, like most CMSs, you click edit or you go to the back end, right? You go to the back end and then suddenly you got content and stuff like that, and you do stuff there, and then you can go back to the front end. Plone kind of insists that, you know, to make it look nice, that you do a lot of work on your theme, you know, adds days and days to your theming process in order to theme it. Can do, depending on your theme. Changing wording, translation, like you can do it with Diazo, but it's really messy. If I just want to change one word that's in the Plone UI or something like that, that comes from the contact form or something, then it should be easy. Yeah, and watching everyone try and, you know, recompile Grunt and all that kind of stuff the other day was interesting. Okay, we could have a remote theme browser built into Plone, where when you've got the theming editor, what happens if you go like click a more button, it then connects up to plone.org, brings in a whole bunch of images of all the possibilities, and you click and install, and then you installed your theme inside Plone. Yeah, so I think it doesn't necessarily have to be the theming UI, but I think that more and more we should have the ability to basically combine all the integration things that you want to do in a single zip file and a single UI through the web. So, for example, if if you're going to write some scripts, some Python code and stuff, you shouldn't have to develop a package to do that. You should be able to do that in the Ace editor online if you want. You should be able to do translations in the theme. You should be able to make localization, customizations that are specific to your particular customer. We've got to stop thinking about themes as being generic, because hardly anyone makes generic themes in Plone. What you end up doing is making a customer-specific Plone. So your theme is now your customer-specific package. It's your policy, your default content, et cetera, et cetera. We could include generic setup inside the theme, and I think ESCO's already got a branch which is doing that, where you install a theme, then you get a button, and then it will install various different settings. You could have an export thing that lets you export certain settings from the registry or from generic setup and put them into XML in the theme, and then you hit export and you got a zip file. The default site content I talked about. I think it'd be really nice to be able to create customized tile types through the web as well when we have Mosaic. And the one problem that everyone has with this is like, oh, it's through the web. It's like, we should get directly into Plone itself. And ESCO also has a work in progress kind of version of this, where you can push and pull from the theme editor. So every change that gets written will get written into Git that's held within memory within Plone, and you can then pull those changes out. What we tend to do, we do most things through the web, and we'll just we'll give it to the customer goes and edits it through the web, and before we do any changes, we pull it down, export it as zip, put it under source control, see if there's any differences, work off that, then export it. But Git built into Plone directly would make that even better. So I want to talk about Gloss, which is something that David Bain's working on. It's quite a nice idea. I don't know how, like the problem with something like this, right? What you're actually doing is you're inserting, you're bringing back the idea that you can insert a little tag into your HTML file and that will insert the content, so you're not writing the rules anymore. The downside on that is you're hiding the rules. But maybe for certain, basic sort of sites and stuff, it's not a bad idea. So you can kind of see that there, that you use basically classes to say where the content should go, and it will work for certain kinds of sites that have been pre-thought out of, want a carousel here, want the title here, etc. There's every one of those has a little class associated with it. So when I talked about theming the back end, this is something we kind of managed to sneak into Plone 5. So this is actually in Plone 5. That you can use. You can actually, there's a little selector on the body that says whether you're actually on the front end or the back end, whether you're on the view thing or you're on site setup, etc., etc. So it's not 100% obvious, but this is Barceloneta. As soon as you click on view, which it will in a minute, it will suddenly switch back to our theme view. What this means is that all this stuff here, you don't have to include in your custom theme. You've got two different themes. You're using the Barceloneta for your back end, and then you're using your custom theme. So if you bring in a theme from Theme Forest or something, which this is, and it makes all its own assumptions about classes, you can not have to worry about bringing in all the classes from Plone. All you have to worry about is bringing in the toolbar only. So it reduces the time to thinking. Running out of time, I know. Over time, okay. So anyway. This is just saying that basically I think that we need to think about who we're trying to attract, and usability is something that could potentially attract more people to Plone, which means we've got more developers, which means we've got more customers, which means we've got more big jobs, and it's a great virtuous cycle. And I think too much as a community we try and encourage, we want Plone developers, we like Python developers, we like Python developers because they're like us, we're Python developers, but they're never gonna use Plone. They build custom apps, that's what they do. We should be trying to encourage, people who use CMSs that aren't nearly as nice as ours to use our CMS. We should be trying to attract designers. Craft is an interesting one. It's very designer friendly. It's an expression engine. Both of those start with a complete blank slate. Now, Diazo kind of works like that, but we don't make it obvious. We don't sort of say that Plone is designer friendly. Diazo makes Plone very designer friendly. We don't use that in our marketing, really. Well, I think the new marketing uses that a bit. So basically, what I'm hoping is that Plone 6, we kind of like, is going to be a bit more on the user-driven side than Plone 5 is, hopefully. So, and that's it. Any questions? Sorry for dumping that all on you guys.
Another question about a comment about the cloud installers.
Yeah.
They're actually coming, the installer team's working on them since a year, but it took just some time because all the people doing installers also doing other stuff.
Yeah.
And it was also really time consuming to talk to cloud providers to get a nice deal what we want to have with them.
Awesome.
But they are coming. Actually, we'll sprint on that also.
Yep.
At this point.
I guess, and also what I was saying is that, it should be like almost before the installers. You know, like it should be the number one option. It shouldn't be sort of buried, which hopefully will happen. So.
That's the discussion point.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
I just want to comment also, we do market that Plone is designer friendly. There's
Yep.
posters
Yep.
out there.
Yep. True.
Also on plone.com.
Yep.
So I know because I wrote it. So
Yep.
you're wrong on that point.
Yep.
But you are right in that we do need to attract more designers.
Yeah, I think the posters are a great start. I think part of it is things like tutorials and stuff like that. Like the theming tutorial seems to ignore through the web diazo completely. For example, some of the things that that I discussed make it harder to approach by designers. I think we need to. A lot of our tutorials, a lot of our sort of recommended ways of doing things are built on big teams for big complicated sites, and somehow we need to. And people are trying to do that. I'm not saying people aren't trying to do that. I'm just saying, like, I'm trying to reiterate the same point. It's a really good thing to do, and the current marketing around Plone saying that it is designer friendly is great. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.